All right, so we have now finished the book Abolition of Man, and what I wanted to do today is just to do a quick review of chapter 3. I hope that we'll be able to meet as a group this weekend, but I wanted to do this quick review so that hopefully it'll help anyone who has specific questions about chapter 3. This review that I'm going to do is based on my own reading of the book, but also with some help from resources such as Michael Ward's book called After Humanity, which is a commentary about the C.S. Lewis's book Abolition of Man, but also used some of the YouTube videos that I've shared with the group over the past several weeks and the different online articles and online commentaries that I found from just a wide variety of people and places over the past several weeks. So hopefully this brief review is helpful for everyone. So let me share my screen, and then we'll do this quick walkthrough of chapter 3. All right, so with chapter 3, the title of chapter 3 is Abolition of Man. Now, ultimately, will also be the title of the book, but in looking at the reason Abolition of Man is the title for chapter 3, that's a question we raise. Why did Lewis give chapter 3 this title, Abolition of Man? And as we've read along over the past 2 chapters, chapter 1 and chapter 2, it led up to this point where C.S. Lewis is drawing our attention to something specific. And the title, I think, is going to help us understand where Lewis is trying to lead us at this point in the book. Michael Ward, the author of the book After Humanity, in this commentary of Abolition of Man, Michael Ward says that he suspects that the reason that C.S. Lewis gave the 3rd chapter the title Abolition of Man is because if we look at the word abolition, Michael Ward said that oftentimes if we think of the word abolition, we think of it in the sense of slavery, and slavery is dehumanizing. And so Michael Ward suggests that C.S. Lewis is using this term abolition intentionally with this idea of the dehumanization of slavery in the background to draw our attention to the fact that a rejection of objective truth and a rejection of objective morality is ultimately a form of enslavement. And subjectivism is dehumanizing because it denies reality and it accepts an illusory view of the world. And so what C.S. Lewis will try to demonstrate in chapter 3 is that a subjectivist approach to the world will ultimately place some men in power over others, and this is dehumanizing. So subjectivism will be dehumanizing in the sense of it denies reality and it promotes this illusory view of the world. It denies objective truth and objective morality, and then it puts some men in power over others ultimately. That's just the ultimate outcome that has to happen with subjectivism. And all of this is dehumanizing and leads to the abolition of man. And so Lewis will, in chapter 3, Lewis will first assess the claim of what he says is man's conquest of nature. And he's going to talk about this as it relates to applied science. And so when Lewis starts to talk about this idea of applied science and man's attempt to conquest nature, C.S. Lewis is not anti-science and he's not anti-technology. He's not trying to argue that technology in and of itself is bad or evil. That's not his intention. Technology is generally morally neutral, but it's how we use it or how we abuse it that causes problems. And it's our intentions behind our use of technology or our intentions behind creating technology that ultimately become the subjects of a moral analysis. So it's not technology isolated from anything else, but it's our application and use of technology, our creation of technology, and the purposes behind it that could be morally good or morally evil. And C.S. Lewis is aware of that, so he's not trying to tell us that all technology is bad with the comments he makes in this chapter. But Lewis will point out that often underlying our scientific discoveries and our scientific achievements, and when we develop different technology, ultimately there's this desire on the part of human beings to control nature. And that's why C.S. Lewis uses this term, man's conquest of nature, or at least our attempt to conquest nature, to conquer nature, to be in control of nature. And that's what C.S. Lewis says sometimes underlies science and technology, and this is problematic, this mentality, this reason for doing science and technology, and that worries him. And then C.S. Lewis is going to give 3 examples of technology in this chapter: the airplane, the radio, which he calls the wireless, and then the birth control pill. I'm just going to talk about the first 2, the airplane and the radio, primarily, just to emphasize the point he's trying to make. But with the airplane, Michael Ward points out that when C.S. Lewis would have written or would have given this presentation, given this talk, and then ultimately when he would have put it into book format, this was in the 1940s. And at that time, airplanes were not for general travel. They were used for military, used by the military in war, or for food drops during famine. If a person had enough money, he could access to an airplane, but this just wasn't something that was accessible to the general population in a widespread way like it is today. The airplanes also might be used to drop propaganda flyers during war. And so these were some of the more common uses for the airplanes, but something to keep that in mind when C.S. Lewis is speaking about the airplane. And so the airplane is an example of the advancements of science and technology. It's a really great invention and discovery of how to use an airplane. But, and it is also an example of man having power over nature, because now with the airplane, men are able to fly. We're able to travel long distances. We're able to do other incredible things that we couldn't do before. So there is this sense the creation of an airplane gives human beings power over nature, but this power over nature was accessible to some men, but not to all. And so in Lewis's time and ours, even if everyone could use a plane for air travel, one still has to rely on a pilot to fly the plane. And so thus the passengers as individuals do not have use of this technology of the airplane to control nature. So the development of the airplane is a form of our conquest of nature to a degree. It's a form of our power over nature to a degree, but it's really only something that is the power of some men over nature, but not all men. And then secondly, it's the power of, it's the accessible power over nature to some, but not all. And even if we can access it and fly in these airplanes, we still need a pilot. So we still need other men to help us take advantage of this technology. And that's what Lewis is trying to draw our attention to, is that there is power over nature with the airplane, but it's not across, it's not a universal power over nature that we all have equally. And this power is really limited to a few. And we could, and some men, the men who have power of using the airplane, they could also use that power that they have over nature, and they can withhold it from other men. And so that's another issue that Lewis points out. So the radio, what he calls the wireless, similarly, the radio could be used for education, it could be used for news, but it could also be used for propaganda. And again, with the radio, only some people have access to the radio, and only some people have knowledge of how to use the radio. And so again, Lewis says that there are, even with the radio, we see an example of how some men could use this power, and these same men could withhold this power from others. And then men could also control what other men would or would not hear. And so this power over nature, with the invention of the radio, there's still this inequality here, where there's some who have access to it and some who don't, some know how to use it, some don't. And it leads to some men being able to manipulate this technology, either for good or for evil, when it comes to things like propaganda or just controlling what people can hear. And so C.S. Lewis wants us to, he's using these examples, but they could apply to a lot of things. But he really wants us to see this disparity, this inequality that exists here. And so what he's trying to really emphasize is that the technology can be used by some men to have control over other men. And this control can be in the form of access, and determining who can benefit from the technology. This control also comes in the form of who will be able to be harmed by the technology. So think of dropping bombs from an airplane that some countries may have been able to do and some couldn't, or spreading propaganda through the radio. And all sides use propaganda to some degree, but the radio gives some people control over others. And C.S. Lewis is going to really emphasize that if you consider how technology can be misused or abused or used as a form of power of some men over others, he says, now consider what he's been talking about throughout this book, that there's been this rejection of the Tao. So if we reject the Tao, we reject any type of objective truth and objective morality. And so the use of this technology has no foundation in the Tao. Just imagine how quickly this power can be abused and misused. And so Lewis is going to say in this chapter, he doesn't want to draw attention to the many abuses that have occurred using science and technology. That's not his point. His emphasis is really that this notion of man's power over nature really means the power of some men over others, especially if we do not have a foundation of the Tao. And Lewis says that this may be men within the same generation who have control. So you may have men who all exist in the same time. Like, let's say everyone who lived in the 1940s. He said it could be you have some men within that generation that control others. And but you can also extend this to future generations. You can have the human beings who exist in the 1940s could make decisions and do things that have power over generations that live 50 years later. And so C.S. Lewis points this out. And then he calls the two groups of people the conditioners and the conditioned. The conditioners are ultimately those men, those human beings who take control. And then the conditioned are those people who are being controlled by the conditioners. And so he says it can happen within the same generation of people, or one generation can have this control over future generations. And the conditioners can use various means to control the conditioned. It's not only what technology they have access to, but the conditioners can control the conditioned in a variety of ways. Technology, education, you name it, they can find ways to control, teaching different worldviews, influencing other different aspects of society. And so they can control, not the conditioners can start to have influence and control over how the conditioned act, what the conditioned believe. And ultimately, C.S. Lewis will say, this is tyranny. You're going to have domination of some human beings over others. And again, he takes this all back to subjectivism and the rejection of the Tao, that he says, ultimately, if you accept subjectivism, this is the ultimate outcome, is this idea of having conditioners and conditioned. There's no other way to have some form of order in the world. You have to ultimately have some people assuming power if we reject the Tao and reject objective truth and objective morality. And he'll continue to explain why as we go on. He says, if the Tao, the idea of objective truth and objective morality, have been accepted, then how people act and what people believe, if the Tao had been accepted, then how people act and what people believe would be guided by the Tao and not guided by the conditioners. They would, if people accept objective morality, people will turn to this objective morality to see how they should act and how they should behave and what they should believe. They wouldn't look to other human beings like these conditioners for influence, or they wouldn't be susceptible to propaganda, because they would know what is true and what is false, what is right and what is wrong, because they're guided by the Tao, not by these conditioners. But Lewis says that if the subjectivism becomes prevalent, and so people have been taught to reject the objective dimension of reality, then in order for there to be some order and to avoid complete lawlessness, then the conditioners who are promoting subjectivism, they must use power to enforce what they hold to be true among the masses. So otherwise you'd have anarchy. So even though the conditioners themselves are promoting subjectivism, they're promoting this idea that there's no objective truth. They're promoting that everyone should just believe, based on their emotions or their desires. The conditioners promote that, although because they realize that if everyone truly lived that way, there'd be anarchy, then the conditioners have to take control and say, well, we're going to enforce what we believe is best and what we believe is good. That way, and we're going to promote this among the masses. We're going to take power and enforce this. Otherwise, we'd have anarchy. There's really no other way the conditioners could make our life anything other than anarchy, if that makes sense. So he says, really, the conditioners are being hypocrites here. I mean, they're saying promote subjectivism, but they realize subjectivism is not something that that's livable. And so, as C.S. Lewis said in the book, on my version, it's page 58, so maybe a little different for you, but he says, quote, each new power won by man over nature, talking about our advances in science and technology or knowledge, each new power won by man is a power over other men as well. Each advance leaves him weaker as well as stronger. And every victory, besides being the general who triumphs, he is also the prisoner who follows the triumphal car. So again, he's trying to emphasize that every time we think that we're dominating nature with science, technology, knowledge, every time we think we're gaining an upper hand, there's also a problem, because this is the power that only some men have access to. And so it ultimately leaves some men being in control over others. And so we have some men being made stronger and some men being made weaker with these advancements in a subjectivist world. And so again, how does the rejection of the Tao factor into this? And so one example, like let's say within myself as a human being, I can have self-control, and this self-control is good and it's often necessary for my well-being. If I were to decide to eat 10 cookies for dinner, and that's all I had every night, I recognize that there is a good of health and there's a duty to care for my physical body and my physical life. This is part of the Tao. Part of the Tao, part of the natural moral law says that there is a good of health and a good of life, and I have a duty to take care of my health and my life. And so I realize that by this objective moral law that exists in our hearts, this natural law. So I choose to eat foods that are ordered to these goods, that are ordered to the good of health and good of life. I reject the idea of eating 10 cookies for dinner every night rather than a healthy meal because I accept this objective morality, I accept the Tao. But imagine I rejected the Tao. I rejected the good of health and I rejected the good of life. If I lived however I chose and just let myself be guided by my desires, my emotions, my passions, and not let my reason factor into this, this would be disordered. I mean, I would definitely eat cookies every single day, every meal, or ice cream or chocolate cake or whatever it may be. But this would be disordered. This would not be for my own good. So my passions, my desires become tyrants because they're dictating what I do and how I live. I'm ignoring my reason. I'm ignoring any other things that I've learned. I'm ignoring the Tao. So my passion becomes tyrants. And so allowing myself to be ruled merely by my animal instincts, this would be dehumanizing. I would allow myself to become enslaved to my passions. And this would happen, and if this happens in every aspect of my life, as well as on a societal scale, this would be the abolition of man. And I think this is where Lewis is trying to go, is take this analogy of how things can become disordered in my own self if I reject objective truth, and how disordered that would be. And that would be dehumanizing because I would just follow my animal instincts only. I'd follow only my passions and emotions. I'd become enslaved to them. Well, then imagine that on a societal scale. And that's what C.S. Lewis is getting at. So just as I would become dehumanized because I'm only following my animal instincts and I'd be enslaved to my passions, then that's this abolition element. I'm becoming enslaved and I'm no longer becoming human. I'm dehumanizing myself. And then Lewis's point is that on a societal scale, it's going to ultimately have to be the conditioners that start to bring some control into the world. And so they'll start to imagine the analogy again of just within my own bodily self. They would have to, the conditioners would be telling me which passions to listen to and which passions to follow, even though they would have no objective foundation to tell me that. They would have to, otherwise it would be complete anarchy and chaos. So Lewis then is going to come to the conclusion that man's conquest of nature is going to inevitably lead to man's conquest of himself, to man's conquest of man. And so what he's going to say, I mean by this, is that human beings will ultimately attempt to try to gain power not only over nature in the material world, but also over man and over human nature, to the point that he'll try to even alter his own genes and try to change his own self, to change human beings to become whoever he wants them to be. He'll kind of create a human being in his own image and likeness rather than in the image and likeness of God. And so man is going to attempt to use, so not only will man use power over human nature and try to change genes and change what it means to be a human being, man will also use education and propaganda to change the beliefs and psychology and the way people view the world. So it's another way that these conditioners are going to try to conquer nature and conquer human beings themselves, is to change how people view the world. And so Lewis is going to say in this chapter, quote, "We shall be free to make our species whatever we wish it to be. The battle indeed will be won, but who precisely will have won it? For the power of man to make himself what he pleases means, as we have seen, the power of some men to make other men what they please." So again, think about this idea of subjectivism, and that people should not be, not have any type of objective foundation. So people can do whatever they want, live however they want, be whomever they want. But ultimately, if we want to avoid anarchy, then ultimately some men, the conditioners, will have to have power over other men to try to keep at least some sense of order in the world. But it's going to be these conditioners who dictate what it means to be human beings and what things are acceptable to do or not to do. And this is a problem because without an objective foundation, C.S. Lewis is saying, ultimately, this means some men will have power over others. It's really an inevitable outcome. And C.S. Lewis will say that in the past, educators did have a role in molding people and shaping people and trying to form people's characters. But these actions were grounded in the Tao, in the objective truth and objective morality. Even if people did not fully and explicitly acknowledge that this is where they were getting their idea of what a good character is, like a good person is, this character formation, people would accept that it's good to be respectful and honest and not to cheat, not to steal, not to lie, to respect your elders. I mean, these things have been accepted for centuries and centuries and centuries, but it's because these ideas of what a good character is are grounded in the Tao. And so people have continued to teach this character formation over the centuries. But these teachers were not simply trying to mold people and shape their character into whatever pattern of living they subjectively thought was true. They relied on the moral truths that have been handed down throughout tradition and over generation and generation for several millennia. People have been handing this down, what it means to be a good person. And that's what's been taught in education, and education has always been seen to have a very important role in character formation. But now, however, with the rejection of the Tao, the goal of education and of character formation is not based on anything that's a given. There is no foundation in the Tao. And so instead, the conditioners will have to condition their pupils and have to influence and persuade and convince their pupils what is good and what is not, what things they should value and what things can have lesser value. And so ultimately Lewis is going to say that they're going to essentially create this artificial Tao. They're going to try to persuade the students of what these conditioners believe should be considered right and wrong, based on just these conditioners' own personal preferences and opinions. But because the conditioners will be in power and will have control, they'll be the ones who are essentially dictating what will be taught in education. And so Lewis says, but if this is the case, because this is the only outcome really with subjectivism, is that you have to have these conditioners who have control over the conditioned. But he says, how will the conditioners decide which values to hold as, quote, good? If they promote subjectivism to be true, then how can there be any type of agreement as to what is good and what is wrong, bad, what is right, what is wrong? These conditioners have no foundation on which to base which values are good and which values are better than others, because they're subjectivists. And Lewis says that some may suppose that Lewis is assuming these conditioners are, quote, bad men. He uses this quote in chapter 3. He says, some people will think I am assuming these conditioners are bad men because C.S. Lewis is worried about the influence these conditioners will have on education. So he says, no, I'm not assuming they're bad men at all. That's not the point. He's like, but these conditioners have rejected the Tao, and they've devoted themselves to the task of, quote, deciding what humanity shall henceforth mean. Good and bad are words without content. So here he's trying to say that how can we even say something is bad if we're subjectivists? Or something, how can we say something is good if we're subjectivists? What you think is good and what I think is good may be completely different. What you think is bad, it may be completely different than what I think is bad, because we're subjectivists. So how can there even be bad men at all? Because we don't even have a foundation to settle that question as to what it means to be bad or what it means to be good. And so he says that without the Tao, these conditioners are deciding what it means to be human. They're deciding what is a good human, what's a bad human, what is it, what's the meaning of human life. I mean, they're deciding all these things. And he says, so if we say good and bad, they don't have any content in a subjectivist world. They're subjective. They're relative to that individual person, whoever is in power, ultimately. And he says that, Lewis says that some men may suppose the conditioners could just then say, well, most of us want more or less of the same thing. So why can we not just say that these are the things we happen to like and then hold those as the values we promote? So Lewis again is back to how do the conditioners decide what values to promote in education, what values to promote in society? And he's saying that it's possible some people may say, well, we all agree basically on the same things. So let's just take those things that we all basically agree on and say that those things are good, say that those things should be valued. But C.S. Lewis will say, well, this is a false premise to hold that most of us really like the same things, because that's not true. We don't all really like the same things. And if we truly promote subjectivism, we will probably find that we all like very different things. And there's a whole wide spectrum of what people would think would be good or bad. And a lot of contrary things too. There'll be many people who believe some things are good, whereas others hold them to be bad. So C.S. Lewis said, I think this premise is wrong to say we will all basically all agree on the same things. But Lewis says that, okay, even if we did agree that we all will like basically the same things, if we reject the Tao and hold to subjectivism, then on what grounds are the conditioners claiming that these values should be promoted for everybody? So even if we all agree, so what? If we live in a subjectivist world, why do we promote things that we all agree on? Who says those things are good just because the majority agree? He says that Lewis says that if we reject the Tao, then we must reject the idea that there are objective values to which we all agree. We must reject that there is a universal duty to promote specific values. He says, if we're subjectivists, there is no duty to promote anything as good. There's no duty to promote anything as wrong. There's no duty to promote anything as having a specific value. If we reject the Tao, how is it that the conditioners can scorn delights, as Lewis says? So he's kind of saying, like, so for example, if conditioners scorn the idea of stealing an object because I desire it and I want to possess it. So let's say I see a Lamborghini car and I'm like, man, I really like that. I really wish I had that car. Well, I'm just going to steal it. I'm a subjectivist. Stealing is not wrong anyways. I want it, so I'm going to take it. So how can a conditioner scorn that? They're saying there's no objective right and wrong. So how can they scorn something I take delight in, stealing this car? But on the other extreme, how can they even scorn acts such as rape or murder? I mean, some people find the aggressors, these immoral aggressors, sometimes take pleasure in doing these immoral things. So how can the conditioners scorn cheating on a test because I take pleasure in making a high mark? There's just really no way that they can scorn certain acts as right or wrong. And there's, if in a subjectivist world, what grounds do they have to claim that there's right and wrong, good and evil, things we have to agree on at all? Lewis says again that he's not saying these conditioners are bad men. And he says, quote, "It's not that they're bad men. They're not men at all. Stepping outside the Tao, they have stepped into the void. Nor are their subjects, the conditioned, necessarily unhappy men. They're not men at all. They are artifacts. Man's final conquest has proved to be the abolition of man," end quote. This is a really powerful line, but he's kind of saying that if we reject the Tao and there's no objective truth, no objective morality, everything's subjective, then we're no longer living in reality. We're going to dehumanize humanity, so we can no longer even consider ourselves as men because we're just simply following our passions, our instincts, following our desires. There's no reason behind how we're acting or living. So this makes us no longer human beings. We're not men anymore. We're just in this void. And he says, even the subjects, the conditioners, it doesn't mean they're unhappy because they're subjectivists. They're not unhappy. He says, it doesn't mean they're unhappy men. He says, they're not men at all. They're just artifacts. The conditioners have just created human beings in their own image and created men the way they see fit, which is not truly what men are. Human beings are made for a purpose, for a reason. There are things that human beings should and should not do. There are things that if we do certain actions, they will make us unhappy. They will make us, they'll dehumanize us. I mean, slavery, for example, is dehumanizing. It would be wrong to say that the subjectivist would have to say slavery cannot be said to be right or wrong because we're subjectivists. But Lewis would say, but see there, you're creating this world that is not real. It's not true. You're no longer living in reality. You're in this void. So he says the conditioners devote themselves ultimately to defining good and bad, but it's based only on their personal opinions and emotions. And so as such, what they call good and bad is in reality completely meaningless because they reject the Tao. There's nothing universal or objective to ground their values. They're redefining good and bad as they please. And ultimately, they're redefining even humanity and what it means to be human. They're recreating man in their own image, and in doing so, they're destroying man. They're making man into something that's illusory. Hence, it's the abolition of man. And so what defines how the conditioners act? So Lewis says the phrase, sic volo, sic jubeo. As I will, so I command, is what it means in Latin. And so he's saying that the conditioners decide what should and should not be done based on their desires. So the conditioners say, well, I command what I will to be good. I command what I will to be bad. And so that's this idea of this power that they have. And so at this point, Lewis says, how can there be anything good in a subjectivist world? How can we even call anything corrupt or degenerate since there's no objective foundation? And this is again in chapter 3. And corrupt is this notion that something has been debased or that something has decayed or that there are errors. But how can there be errors if there's no objective truth? And if there's no objective measure of what is normal or what something should be, then how can we say something has become debased? So Lewis says we can't, if we're subjectivists, we can't call things good or bad. We can't call things corrupt or degenerate. And so Lewis says, quote, the very words corrupt and degenerate imply a doctrine of value and are therefore meaningless in this context of subjectivism. So these conditioners have no ground for preferring one value over another other than an emotional impulse. So why should one person accept the emotional preference of another? He says, moreover, how can we even hope that the conditioners will be benevolent, since they cannot even say that benevolence is good because they're subjectivists? Lewis said, quote, "At the moment then of man's victory over nature, we find the whole human race subjected to some individual men, and those individuals subjected to that in themselves which is purely natural, to their irrational impulses." And so nature, untrammeled by values, ultimately rules the conditioners, and through them rules all humanity. And so here's one of the key lines: "Man's conquest of nature turns out, in the moment of its consummation, to be nature's conquest of man." So when man finally thinks he has gained power over all nature, including power over human beings, power over human nature, ultimately, though, what happens with these subjectivists who make this claim is the subjectivists, the conditioners, are guided by their instincts, these irrational impulses, these emotions. And these irrational impulses, these instincts, are just kind of these animal instincts. And so the conditioners themselves are guided by these instincts, and they lead other human beings to accept these same instincts. And so nature ultimately conquers man. And so ultimately, Lewis is pointing out that man becomes merely an object that can be manipulated. And since the Tao has been rejected, the motivations for acting are mere impulses of nature. Nature then rules man. So we become trousered apes. Lewis uses this phrase, trousered apes, earlier in the book. And so ultimately that's what's happening. We allow ourselves to become merely animals who wear clothes because we're just being guided by our animal instincts and nothing more. We're not listening to reason or to the Tao. We're just going by instinct. We become trousered apes. And this view of humanity is dehumanizing. To view man as an object that we can manipulate at will, to say that I can take myself and others and make of my life whatever I please, becoming whomever I want, this subjective approach rejects reality. It rejects that there's anything objective about humanity and about the meaning of life. It rejects any idea that we were made for a particular purpose, and this rejects any notion that there are ever actions that I should never do. But Lewis says that what is often missed by those who accept this subjectivist worldview is that in rejecting the Tao, this objectivity, we're ultimately giving control of some men over others. We're allowing ourselves to become puppets of the conditioners. The conditioners will act either through persuasion, propaganda, power, coercion, so that ultimately others will see the world as they do. The conditioners will be tyrants, essentially. But then even us, the conditioned, we're going to be men without chests. We will be slaves to our emotions as well as slaves of the conditioners. And by rejecting objective truth, we'll either not use reason, since reason is useless without truth. If there's no truth, then there's no need to use our reason to find truth. Or at a minimum, our ability to use logic and use reason will atrophy due to disuse. This gift of reason will no longer be able to defend us against the conditioners because we've lost our ability to use it. So we lose our cognitive capacity to think, to reason, to rationalize, to be able to listen to different sides of an argument and try to discern what's right and wrong. If we're subjectivists, we don't use this gift of reason properly. And so it's going to atrophy. We'll stop understanding how to use reason, or we'll just see reason as useless because there is no truth. This is a problem because subjectivism is not true. But if we let our gift of reason become atrophied, then we won't have any defense against the conditioners. The propaganda they'll use, we will not be able to recognize it. And so Lewis says that one of the things that he sees happening here with this idea of subjectivism and men trying to have power over nature and men having power over other men, he says, quote, "It's the magician's bargain. Give up our soul, get power in return. But once our souls, that is ourselves, have been given up, the power thus conferred will not belong to us. We shall in fact be the slaves and puppets of that to which we have given our souls." And so this statement's about the subjectivists and the subjectivist worldview. If people accept this subjectivist worldview, it's going to ultimately will become enslaved to our passions and to others. And this analogy that Lewis used reminded me of the stories like with the genie, the cartoon movie Aladdin that came out a long time ago, one of my favorite. At the end of Aladdin, the guy named Jafar, he wants power. He wants cosmic, universal power. He wants power over everything. And ultimately, at the end, the genie grants his wish that he wants power, cosmic, infinite power. He grants his wish. But what Jafar realizes is that this power that he's given has consequences. He's given this power and discovers it's not everything he expected, because he is given all this power, but then he realizes he's confined to the genie's lamp. In order to have this cosmic power, in order to be a genie who can do anything in the world, he is given this power, but in the movie it says something like he's given infinite cosmic power, but has an itty bitty living space because he's in this lamp. And so his infinite powers can then only be used at the request of a master who rubs the lamp. So the genie could grant every wish in the world. He can do anything and everything possible for them. I think one of the things they can't do is make someone fall in love. But other than that, he has this cosmic power, but it's at the whim of another. He can only do it when someone else, based on someone else's desires. So it kind of reminded me of what Lewis is trying to say here, is that if we give up our soul to get power, often we're going to find that we become slaves to whomever we've given our soul to for this power. Hope that makes sense. But when subjectivists adopt this worldview because they desire full control, they don't want to answer to any other authority. They reject that the world and that men are created in a particular way with a particular purpose. They do not want to accept that there are any limits. They want to live however they want. But the reality is there are consequences. And it's something we all find out as we live every single day. Actions have consequences. Ideas have consequences. The subjectivists want to deny that, but you really can't escape reality. But they try to. They reject the Tao, but ultimately what this means is they become enslaved, and ultimately they really do lose true freedom because they're not free to become the person they were made to be. They reject that that's even a reality. And so again, it results in this abolition of man, because man becomes a slave to his passions, to his emotions, or to others. All right, so I'm getting kind of, on my version, page 71, 72, Lewis says that one danger with science and technology and with man's efforts to conquest nature is that we can lose an appreciation of the beauty and majesty and magnificence of nature. So Lewis's quote is this. He says, quote, "The stars lost their divinity as astronomy developed." It's not that the stars are gods, but Lewis is saying that as we continue to focus on the stars as objects for us to learn more about and ultimately to control if possible, we start to see them merely as balls of fire rather than see them as these majestic, grand things in the universe. And he says, Lewis says similarly, quote, "We do not look at trees as beautiful objects while we cut them into beams," end quote. Again, he's saying, like, sometimes as we try to gain control over nature or gain knowledge over nature, we have to be careful, because sometimes this causes us to lose an appreciation of the awesomeness of nature, of the beauty of nature. And so Lewis will essentially talk about how as science tries to manipulate nature, nature becomes more and more objectified, and we lose any sense of value that applies to nature. We stop asking the deeper questions. We lose any sense of mystery. And he sees this again being a problem with subjectivism, because there's no value in things in any objective way. The value is simply subjective. It's my preferences, my emotions. I give value to things. And what you and I value may be different. And to a subjectivist, that's okay. Lewis would say, no, there is an objective dimension to the world. There are things, there is value in things, whether or not we appreciate it. back in the beginning of chapter 1, like with the waterfall. There is something magnificent about a waterfall, regardless of whether or not I appreciate it. The subjectivist would deny that, but Lewis is going to say that as you accept subjectivism and only see nature as objects to be manipulated, you lose this sense of magnificence and majesty and mystery. But then he says that if this happens when we try to conquer nature, what do we expect is going to happen when man tries to conquer man? When man tries to conquer his own human nature? If we objectify nature and lose the sense of mystery and magnificence, what do we think will happen when we do the same thing to human beings? And this objectification of humanity, this notion that man can recreate himself as he pleases, it's dehumanizing. Again, it's the abolition of man. And Lewis will note that we can fall prey to subjectivists without realizing it unless we're always on guard. He says it's not a matter of politics. It doesn't matter which side of the aisle you're on when it comes to politics. It can happen on both sides. You may find subjectivists on any political, no matter what political persuasion a person is, they could be a subjectivist. It's not limited to one side or the other. He also says you'll find subjectivists among all different types of careers and fields, philosophers, scientists, educators, really anywhere. No one is immune from being a subjectivist or from falling into the persuasion of a subjectivist. And so Lewis essentially is going to say that many people drink of the poison of subjectivism, so we have to be always on guard for it, because we'll see it everywhere. I mean, we can see already some examples in our society today where people change the meaning of words as if these words do not have an objective meaning. Love, sex, gender, happiness, liberal, conservative, person, all these words have been manipulated over time to mean different things. People also today judge what is right and wrong based merely on emotion. That's a subjectivist view of the world. People promote truth merely based on opinion. Again, that's a subjectivist worldview. So Lewis will then talk a little bit about magic and science. And so he in one of the videos that I sent out, and also Peter Kraft will also talk about this in some of his talks and books about C.S. Lewis, is that C.S. Lewis will kind of try to compare magic and applied science. And so the way to think about this that I found really helpful in these different resources was, let's take these four categories: magic, science, technology, and religion. If I were to ask you to put these into two groups of two based on similarities, how would you group them? So think about that for a minute. And while you think about that, Peter Kraft gave an example to kind of help as you think in one of the resources that I read of his. He says, if you take a baseball bat, a basketball, and a basketball hoop with net, and then I ask you to put these into two groups of two based on similarities, how would you do that? And he said that sometimes some people may choose to group these structurally. Other people may choose to group them functionally. And so what do I mean by that? Structurally is how they're used. So you may group a baseball and a basketball together because they're both balls. And then you group the bat and the basketball net differently because structurally they're different than the balls. And so you kind of look at just structurally, how are they made, or how are they used? And so some people may group them that way. But he says functionally, you could group them differently. Functionally looking at their purpose. What's the purpose of each of these items? And he says you could group the baseball and the baseball bat together because the purpose is to use them in the game of baseball, and the bat hits the ball, and so on. And then the purpose of the basketball is with the basketball net. The two of those go together to play the game of basketball. There's this sense of structure groupings or functional groupings. So let's go back to our previous question about magic and science and religion and technology. So how would you group these into two groups of two? So some people would group science and technology together and religion and magic together. And again, as I mentioned earlier, there's the video I sent out that was the YouTube video by Benjamin McLean, and then also Peter Kreeft talks about this. And so these are one possible way of grouping them. And if you group them this way, this is called the methodological grouping based on their method. And so science and technology are both empirically verifiable, use the scientific method in these two areas. But things that are not empirically verifiable would be like religion and magic. It doesn't necessarily mean they're right or wrong, it just means they're not empirically verifiable, where science and technology are. So that's grouping them based on their methodological, their method. But Lewis says, no, let's not sort these by method. Let's sort these by the ends, the goals, the purpose. And so if you do it that way, then science and religion would be grouped together and magic and technology would be grouped together. And so what does he mean by this? The goal of science and religion is to conform to objective reality, to seek to understand existing reality. It's for knowledge, but a knowledge to help you understand what is real and what is true. The others, magic and technology, you could group them because their goal is to reshape external technology or external reality to match one's thoughts, to seek control, to make your idea become real. Now, again, this grouping doesn't mean something's good or bad or right or wrong. It's the goal of magic, the goal of technology is to manipulate external reality, to seek to control something, particularly external reality. So C.S. Lewis would say that science and religion go together because there is something objective that they're looking for if you're doing science the right way, if you're doing science because of the love of knowledge and the love of trying to understand reality. And same thing with religion. But he's going to say, you know, magic, and when he says applied science, he's talking about this technology, applied science. Magic and applied science, magic and technology can be problematic because they're seeking to control things. And so Lewis says, quote, "For the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality, and the solution had been knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. For magic and applied science, the problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of men. The solution is a technique, and both in the practice of this technique are ready to do things hitherto regarded as disgusting and impious." End quote. So again, he's comparing science and religion that are both seeking knowledge to understand reality in what the wise men of old would do, conforming the soul to reality. But then magic and technology, magic and applied science, they're looking to subdue reality to the wishes of men. And this is a problem because sometimes you'll use magic and technology to do things that you should not be doing, things that would once have been considered disgusting and impious and wrong. So again, it's not that Lewis sees all technology as bad, but he sees a danger when the true object is to extend man's power to the performance of all things possible. Technology becomes a problem when we see that man is trying to gain this power over all things, to do anything that is possible. This is something that I've often heard called the technological imperative, this idea that because we can, therefore we should. That's this danger with technology, is that some people start to think that just because we can do something means we should, and that's not the case. Lewis is going to say this is dangerous to think this way, but it is sometimes what happens, especially in a subjectivist worldview. Without the Tao, you do not have an objective morality, an objective foundation that tells you that you should, that technology should have, you know, these limitations to it, that are these moral limitations. And Lewis will distinguish between the scientist who loves science and knowledge because of his love for truth, and distinguish this from the scientist who loves science because of a love of power and a desire for control and manipulation. And the latter is dangerous. And so Lewis will point out another danger. If we reject the Tao, On what does the scientist ground his work? On what do we base decisions about what technology is good and what technology is harmful? And Lewis will conclude by saying that maybe he's asking the impossible. Maybe when science analyzes objects, the only option is to objectify it so much that we kill it, that we take away any sense of purpose or mystery or magnificence. And Lewis will say, and maybe the only way to truly analyze an object is after we have killed it. This is towards the end of the chapter when he talks about the basilisk, that that animal who he's saying that, you know, maybe you have, anyway, this is towards the very end of the chapter. But he's just saying that maybe we have to objectify material things so much in order for science to work. And in doing so, we've essentially killed any mystery and magnificence of these objects. He says, so maybe I'm asking the impossible to think that we shouldn't be doing that. And then Lewis says he worries that this approach, this subjectivist approach, this objectification of everything, he's worried this will lead to the destruction of reason, because if we reduce everything to the purely material, we risk losing sight of the transcendental realities and of there being a true purpose for created things. We risk seeing material things as merely things we can manipulate, we risk seeing material things as merely things we can manipulate as we wish, once we have the power to do so. So once we invent certain technologies and have power, then we should just do whatever we want, manipulate things how we want. And so he says, add this to the subjectivist view that rejects objective truths about the world, and then there's no obstacles to how we use technology. The accumulation of these ideas, Lewis thinks, will destroy reason. And then to explain how Lewis thinks this destroys reason, he uses the analogy of a window. So again, he's saying that he's concerned this subjectivism, reducing the material world to nothing but the purely material as being things we just manipulate, that we're going to lose our gift of reason. And how? So here's the window, the very end of the chapter. He says the purpose of a window is that we can see through it to the garden outside. And this garden that we see is opaque, which means there's something there. There's something we can see. There's something that's objective, something that's real. So imagine looking out the window of your house into the backyard garden, and there's beautiful trees and flowers and bushes and you know, maybe a rock garden, a waterfall. These are real things. They're opaque and they're objective. You can see them. That's what the window is for. But he says, but what if the garden was also transparent like the window? You look through the window only to look through the transparent garden. But if everything is transparent, there's nothing there. It's an invisible world. There's no seeing a garden because there's nothing there to see. And so he says the window to the opaque garden is like a world that accepts the Tao, accepts the natural moral law, accepts objective truth. The window to the transparent garden is like the subjectivist world. Everything's invisible. There's no grounding, there's no foundation, nothing is real. And if everything is invisible, how do we use our gift of reason? Reason helps us to evaluate and analyze and discover truth, to discover reality. But there is no truth to be found. There's no garden in a subjectivist's invisible world. In the subjectivist world, there's no difference between darkness and light. Moreover, they can't see, but they're not aware of their blindness. And so these two worldviews are so different. Imagine the first man, the one who can actually see a garden. Imagine him trying to explain what the garden looks like that he sees to someone who looks out the same window and sees an invisible garden. I mean, these two men have completely different worldviews. And so Lewis says it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to dialogue. And so this also happens when someone who accepts the Tao tries to discuss this with the subjectivists. So C.S. Lewis sees there's going to be a tremendous problem here with dialectic and dialogue with people who accept these two radically different worldviews. And that's going to be how he concludes this book, is that this is how he sees the problem. And this is why he thinks there's going to be such a difficult problem moving forward, because how do we even have conversations? How do we even try to help a subjectivist understand the world the way we see it? We being those of us who accept the Tao. And then in the appendix, what you'll find, we're not going to go through it, but Lewis is going to use quotes from a variety of sources to try to demonstrate that a belief in the Tao, in the natural moral law, is universal. He's going to quote Christians and Jews and pagans and Hindus and others. He's going to show a few different things that universally people have agreed are good. He's going to show some moral truths that are universal to show evidence that it's not a Christian thing strictly to believe in this universal moral law, to believe in objective truth. This is universal and has been believed for thousands of years. And so he's going to demonstrate that regardless of how these different cultures view the world or even view man, because there are differences, but despite these differences, there's a common thread, the natural moral law. And this is not invented, it's discovered. The Christians, the Jews, the pagans, the Hindus don't agree on this natural moral law because we all invented it together. We have each individually, these different cultures have discovered it, because this objective universal moral law exists, and it exists because it's of the type of universe we live in and because of who man is. And so that really kind of concludes the third book, or the third chapter of the book, and the book itself. The only final point I would add would be something that I had read. I thought it was Michael Ward's book, After Humanity, but I've read so many different resources that I could not actually find the page or the quote that this came from, but it's something I had taken notes on, and I think it's really helpful to think about. So in this book, Abolition of Man, as well as many other books that C.S. Lewis wrote, he's going to emphasize that sometimes he sees that modernity often promotes this idea that a great man is one who stands at some extreme, fighting for some value, fighting to the point that it's become ideological. And this is a problem, because Lewis is going to say that this act of becoming ideological, this idea of becoming so closed-minded about things, is going to leave, a man is going to find himself unbalanced and polarized. And polarization is different than the idea of polarity. And like I said, I can't remember if this was Michael Ward who said this, or if this was a Dr. Jerry Root who I also listened to that said this, but I think it's a really important point, that polarization is different from the idea of polarity. Polarity refers to having an opposing position. This in itself is not a problem. We can disagree with others, and really love accepts disagreement. Disagreement and debate can be healthy, and they can be essential as we search for truth. Hearing the opinion and perspectives of others can be very fruitful, and it's something we should always encourage. We should always listen to both sides of an opinion, especially today with a lot of people on very loud on different sides of different arguments, whether it's science or politics or morality or whatever it is. There's people on opposing positions. Listen to each other. Have healthy disagreements and healthy dialogue, because it can help us understand truth more deeply. So polarity is a good thing. But once we become completely polarized, this is where we become closed-minded. This is where we start to see people falling into ideologies. And this can be, and often is, an obstacle, not only for finding truth, but also being able to have fruitful dialectic and fruitful dialogue with other people. And so this idea of polarization is something we don't want. This idea of realizing there is polarity is okay. Polarity is good. It's healthy to help us find truth. I think this, having different opinions and different ideas is just part of being human, part of being in our world. This idea of polarity does not mean there's not objective truth. It just means sometimes we need to have debates and disagreements to find truth. But we want to stay away from polarization, or where people become so closed-minded, so ideological, that they start to become so unable to be able to have conversations with others. It's going to be an obstacle for truth. So I just wanted to add that too, because I think it is important in our conversations, and as we start to think about how to maybe move forward and think about the world and have conversations with people about the world, that this is something we want to be aware of can happen too, and try to refrain from being polarized and stay kind of in this healthy area of accepting that there is objective truth, but realizing sometimes we need to have healthy debates to get there and to understand that truth more deeply. So, all right, well, I will conclude with that. Hopefully this has been helpful. Watch the group page, and I'll post the information about the date and time for our group discussion on the book. And if you have any questions, let me know. All right, well, thank you. Let me log out of this, and all right, well, have a good rest of the week. Take care.